Imagine that you have just had the greatest day at work ever. You finished a project, let's say, and you've been working on this project for many weeks. Today was the day that you presented your final results, even though you've been presenting off and on throughout the project, but you presented your final results to your manager, who was, let's just say, beyond impressed. He was very pleased. Before you even left his office, he slid a bonus across the table to you and said, "Here, I am so happy with what you've done, and don't worry, there's a raise following that." Before you go home, imagine that an email went out to all your coworkers, again, praising your name, how wonderful you did on this project, this performance. This is the model for everyone. It's been a great day. You can't wait to get home and tell your wife about your day. You pull the car into the garage, and, before you even get a chance to call out, "Honey, I'm home," she yells out, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here. The diaper of the baby needs changed. I'm in here cleaning up puke. You got to take care of that." Welcome back to reality. This morning, it seems as if the disciples receive a similar dose of reality in the text that we're going to look at. And I have to wonder, do we need some of the same? Do we need to be hit just a little bit with reality this morning? Last week, we came to the climax, the climactic answer, really, of the question that Luke has been working through for weeks now in our series through his gospel. The question of, who is Jesus? Luke introduced this question when Jesus, remember, calmed the storm there on the Sea of Galilee, and the disciples looked at him in awe and said, "Who then is this?" Herod, the ruler of the region of Galilee, he voiced the same question as he was wondering about who Jesus was. Jesus himself, he asked his disciples, "Who is it that people are saying that I am?" And then Jesus asked the disciples specifically, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter responded with that great declaration, "The Christ of God." Last week, the key question was not asked again, but the answer was given in the most clear fashion anyway. Jesus, remember, took 3 of his disciples up on the mountain there with him, his inner circle. They were there, and while he was praying, he was transfigured. The glory of Jesus' deity was suddenly on brilliant display, shining forth from him. And then Moses and Elijah was there, and they discussed his departure, which, remember, we said is approaching closely. His exodus, as it was called, as he will soon be heading toward Jerusalem for the last time. His death is near. Yet before he made that final trip, this mountaintop experience was the culmination of the answer to the question, because God the Father spoke directly and said, "This is my Son, my chosen one." Well, this morning we're picking up right on the heels of that great declaration. Jesus is clearly in a class by himself. The Father's pronounced his own divine identification of Jesus. But what does this mean? What does it mean? What are the practical implications for the disciples, and by extension for us? What are the implications that Jesus is the Son of God, the chosen one? How are we to respond? The reality is that the disciples are going to wrestle with these questions for quite some time. Frankly, we likely wrestle with these questions as well. What does it mean to us that Jesus is the Son of God? To help us wrestle with these questions, Jesus and Luke specifically brings us to four very brief events that help us in very quick series begin to understand the disciples' struggle with this revelation. And as we look at these four events together, I'm going to approach them in one sermon. As we bring them together, the overall point that comes out is that our King's greatness should capture our full attention. We've seen him identified as the King. He's the Messiah. Luke laid that out from the beginning. We now have this great declaration. He is the Son of God. He is the Christ. That should capture our full attention. But does it? We need a dose of reality. As I said, there's four separate events in our verses this morning, and we'll look each one in turn as each one makes a statement about our King's greatness. Our King's greatness should capture our full attention. In verse 37, where we pick up, through the first part of verse 43, the first event that we're looking at this morning, we see here that our King displays the greatness of God. Our King, Jesus, he displays the greatness of God. On the next day, when they came down from the mountain, a large crowd met him. And a man from the crowd shouted, saying, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only boy." And a spirit seizes him, and he suddenly screams, and it throws him into a convulsion with foaming at the mouth. And only with difficulty does it leave him, mauling him as it leaves. I begged your disciples to cast it out, and they could not. And Jesus answered and said, "You unbelieving and perverted generation, how long shall I be with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." While he was still approaching, the demon slammed him to the ground and threw him into a convulsion. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit and healed the boy and gave him back to his father. And they were all amazed at the greatness of God. We'll stop there. This is one of those places where our verse divisions is a little bit unfortunate in where it's placed in our text. The rest of verse 43 actually introduces the next event. The event here is this demon-possessed child, and we're told by Luke this occurs on the morning following the transfiguration. As soon as Jesus and the three they took up there with him, that inner three of his disciples, Peter, John, and James, as soon as they're coming down from the mountain, this happens. Now, that suggests at the very least that Jesus and the disciples stayed on the mountain overnight. Maybe that means transfiguration happened during the night. As I said last week, we don't really know when it happened, but if you just imagine, think how stunning it would have been if that happened during the dark hours of night, for him suddenly be transformed. It also explains maybe why the disciples were tired and fell asleep, but they seem to have that gift, period. They can fall asleep while they wait. But anyway, they're coming down now in the morning, and obviously the rest of the disciples, the other 9 of the 12 that were waiting down below, they're not alone. We're told a large crowd is gathered. In my mind, I tend to picture the rest 9, maybe they're a little bit like a security group. You know, they guarded the entrance to the trailhead that takes you up to the top of the mountain so the crowd couldn't follow. At least that's how I picture it. So, okay, I think to use our imagination sometimes when we read narrative, as long as we separate what we're imagining from what God has said. Make sure we keep that distinction. But you have the 9 disciples down here in this large crowd, and as soon as Jesus comes, one person calls out. This one man yells out at the crowd, begging Jesus to heal his son. The call is particularly poignant because when he calls out, he calls out, identifies him as his only son. Even Luke uses the same word that we know Jesus so well as the only begotten of God. This is his only begotten son. And he yells that his son has a demon that throws him into these convulsive seizures. And when that happens, the harm is brought to the child because he hurts himself. And he adds that the disciples were unable to cast out the demon. Now we should recall from verse 1 in this chapter that Jesus specifically gave the disciples power and authority over all the demons. That's what it says in verse 1. Before Jesus sent them out on that preaching tour that you may recall, he sent them out so they were forced to deal with the question of who is Jesus, because they had to explain to people, as they proclaimed the kingdom of God, who the king was. They had to work through it. Sometimes, as I said, the best way to learn something is to teach it. Well, during that time, they apparently had no problems healing demons, handling the demons they encountered. But now, these 9 disciples that were left behind the day before, they're unable to deal with the demon that's affecting this man's son. Jesus' response to the man's statement is not exactly positive as far as the disciples are concerned. You unbelieving and perverted generation. Ouch. I mean, just think about it. You're on the receiving end of that. How does that sound? Jesus is not mincing words, is he? I don't think we can read these words without understanding them as rebuke to the disciples. Sure, the entire crowd, I think, is included in the accusation, but the disciples are certainly not excluded. They're part of that group. Despite all that they've seen, despite all that they've heard, they still did not fully grasp who Jesus is. It's likely they understood that he had the power of God, but they still didn't grasp that he was God. They saw him perform miracles, but interpreted the miracles as amazing feats rather than evidence that they're in the presence of God. The problem was, as Jesus points out, or at least implies here, he's not going to be with them that much longer. We know he just talked about his departure. His time is coming to an end. They needed to get their understanding worked out. Jesus hits them with these words, and then he calls the boy to himself, and the demon, as the boy is approaching, makes a final spectacle of his possession. And then Jesus just moves the demon with a rebuke. There's an instant reaction when Jesus speaks. The demon leaves the boy. The boy's healed. Look carefully at the first part of verse 43, though. Notice the response that this miracle generates. They were all amazed, that all, must include the disciples as well as the crowd, all amazed at the greatness of God. Somehow, as Jesus rebukes the demon, his words, his actions, they make it clear to all the crowd that's there, including the disciples, that the glory for this belongs to God. This is God at work. Now, we can wonder if the disciples had attempted to bring glory to themselves when they tried to throw the demon out, but the text doesn't specify that. What is clear is that Jesus caused the people to become astonished at the majesty of God. Any attention that came his way was immediately reflected to the Father, because our King displays the greatness of God. You know, another thing we can observe in passing is that amazement is not the same as faith. The people were awed by this miracle that they saw. They were amazed. They even recognized in their amazement that this represents the majesty of God. It puts the majesty on God on display. And yet very few of these people had true faith. Because we know in the not too distant future, the crowds largely turn from Jesus. And rather than being amazed by Jesus, they call for his crucifixion. Somehow between this moment and that moment, in the not so distant future, these people are able to explain away all the miracles that they've observed and harden their hearts in their rejection of the true King. Amazement does not equate to faith. I believe that for us, the direct application in this first event that we're looking at here is really found in the example of the disciples. Sadly, that's where we reflect as we look in the mirror. we will likely find ourselves unbelieving more than we care to admit. I know I've been guilty of that myself at times. I was talking about this even in Sunday school this morning. For example, I know Jesus can save people. I've seen Jesus save people. I've even personally experienced the power of Jesus to save people. But do I believe Jesus will save my neighbor when I share the gospel? All too often I doubt that Jesus will do in my life the things that I know he does in general. I'm like the disciples. The problem is that I failed to keep my focus on his greatness. I failed to focus on his greatness and the joy that Jesus has in displaying his greatness. Because his greatness is God's greatness. What I and you as well, what we need is to truly comprehend that Jesus, our King, displays the greatness of God all the time. He is God. He displays the greatness of God. Our King's greatness should capture our full attention. Our King displays the greatness of God. We see that illustrated here in this first event this morning, as God's greatness is on display, demonstrated through Jesus. From displaying the greatness of God, Jesus immediately discusses a very different display of his greatness in the next verses. He discusses how our King's greatness is displayed by his sacrifice. It's displayed by his sacrifice. Picking up there in the middle of verse 43. But while everyone was marveling at all that he was doing, he said to his disciples, "Let these words sink into your ears, for the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men." But they did not understand this statement, and it was concealed from them so that they would not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask him about this statement. While everyone was marveling, that would include the disciples again. They're part of everyone that's in this large group. While everyone's marveling, somehow Jesus is able to turn to the disciples and have a conversation with them. It's like the large crowd, they're busy just kind of talking about them among themselves, and Jesus somehow is able to give this aside to his disciples. Jesus had introduced to the disciples the idea that he would suffer soon. He introduced that back in verse 22, right after Peter made that profound declaration that you are the Christ. He said, yeah, the Christ will die. The inner three, Peter, John, and James, they certainly knew about Jesus' suffering at this point because they just watched him have that conversation with Moses and Elijah on the mountaintop about his departure, his exodus. That was all dealing with the coming suffering he would have. But now, as the disciples are marveling over this miracle he just performed, Jesus again speaks of his coming suffering. He tries to bring a dose of reality. He uses the phrase, "Let these words sink into your ears." That's a call to pay close attention. It is really the verbal equivalent of grabbing someone by the shoulders and putting them up against a wall and looking right in their eyes so that they hear what you're saying. This is something important. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. The Son of Man is going to be delivered. Be delivered. You know, once in a while we have to pull out these grammatical things. Be delivered, that's a passive verb. It's happening to Jesus. Jesus is making clear that this is going to happen from another, but it's not an accident because he is being delivered. It's intentional. His coming suffering is at the hands, we know, of the religious leaders in Jerusalem, but there's no accident because he's being delivered into their hands. It's part of the plan of God. It's part of God's plan for his greatness. This is a divine passive. God is the one who's doing the work. Jesus is one who's on the receiving end. God is the active one behind all these coming events. Of course, Luke goes out of his way to emphasize that the disciples really aren't grasping what he's talking about. This goes beyond his ability to comprehend. They're unable to wrap their minds around the idea that his greatness would be displayed through total and complete sacrifice. That is so far outside their comprehension that they were even afraid to ask Jesus about it. Of course, the disciples did come to understand what he meant. After the cross, they came to understand it fully. Our four Gospels really trace the process of the disciples coming to an understanding what Jesus is referring to here. We live on the other side of the cross. We know that the cross was not a defeat of his greatness. Rather, the cross was the pinnacle of his greatness. The cross was where Jesus had victory. It wasn't a defeat. It was where he conquered. He conquered sin and death. The cross is his greatest victory. Our King, his greatest display of greatness, comes because our King displayed his greatness through sacrifice. We get that. But we need that dose of reality. Sacrifice displays greatness. Our King's greatness should capture our full attention. His greatness is on display by his sacrifice. That's the second idea that we see here about our King's greatness as we look through these four things. In the second event, we're shown that our King's greatness is displayed by his sacrifice. Moving on in verses 46 through 48, we have a third short little event that is placed here by Luke. And in this event, we can learn that our King's greatness demands humble service toward others. Humble service toward others. An argument started among them, that's the disciples still, as to which of them might be the greatest. But Jesus, knowing what they were thinking in their heart, took a child and stood him by his side, and said to them, "Whoever receives this child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me. For the one who is least among all of you, this is the one who is great." Now, the way Luke has structured things, we can't tell how close this event is to the healing of the demon-possessed boy just a short while ago. There might be some time in between, but what we can tell is Luke placed these next to one another. Luke's placed them back to back so that at least for us, Jesus has just spoken about his sacrificial death. He's just told the disciples, here's what's coming. And the disciples turn around and argue about which of them should have the highest honors in the group. You know, we might sit here and mentally shake our heads at the disciples, wondering how can they be so dense? But I have been involved in way too many petty squabbles over the years to think they're unique. Petty squabbles over matter of pride. The disciples are no different from us. For that matter, I'm personally too easily offended by others to think that my pride is any less than theirs. We need this lesson. We need this dose of reality. I've got to imagine that the disciples were not having this argument within Jesus' earshot. It says, this argument started among them. I can't imagine Jesus was standing right there if they did that. But it doesn't matter because Jesus knows that they're arguing in their heart. Luke uses the same word in both verses here. In verse 46 and 47, he uses the same word. In the New American Standard, we have it translated in verse 46 as an argument. In verse 47, it's translated as thinking. But it's the same word. It can mean a thought or a reasoning. In verse 46, they're reasoning with each other. maybe loudly, but they're reasoning with each other. But verse 47 makes it clear that what they're voicing is really what they've already reasoned in their heart. They're concerned about who's most important in this group. I suppose at least the three that were up on the mountain with Jesus and saw the transfiguration, they think, well, we're at least cut above the other 9. At least in my imagination, I easily can envision them thinking that way. Anyway, even though Jesus doesn't hear the discussion, nothing gets past him. Jesus takes this child that happens to be nearby, so obviously there's still more people around. He takes this child and he stands this child next to him and says, "Whoever receives this child in my name receives me," and so on. The point that Jesus is making in the culture of the day, children are nothing. A child was a person with no stature. A child was unimportant. A great person would not allow his time to be consumed with caring for children. Yet, what Jesus says by using this child as an illustration, he flips the script of the day. He flips the conventional thinking around. He puts it right on its head. Jesus indicates that doing the most humble of service imaginable is what displays greatness when it's done in his name. Receiving a child is akin to receiving Jesus. Receiving Jesus is akin to receiving God the Father, who is the one who sent Jesus on the mission. This mission we've been following. The mission that is headed toward the most humble service imaginable, the cross. Here's where things start to get a little more pointed for us. Just as we all likely struggle with instinctive desires for recognition, we all need to hear the challenge of humbly serving others, especially those who are considered least significant in the society. You see, the benefit that comes when we serve those who are least significant is we serve them knowing that we're really probably not going to get anything back in return. It's not that big a sacrifice to serve somebody that might be able to reciprocate when we need it. But if we serve the least significant, we're truly serving just for Christ. But this isn't easy. You know, think about it. Say God has gifted you with a great voice. Not me. That's why I can use this as an imagine. You've got such a voice that singing a solo in church is a blessing. It's a blessing that will likely draw accolades from people who appreciate your singing. Even if your goal is to sing praise and glory for God, there will be likely some appreciation of your ability that comes your way. By comparison, if you help a young child carry his plate through the potluck line, there probably won't be a line of people giving you praise for it. There might be a frazzled mother that says thank you, but it's unlikely that the rest of Jim will stand up and applaud how wonderful you were to carry the child's plate. But that's the sort of action that Jesus says is demanded by him, our great King. We are to do that which is humble. We are to humbly serve others. We are to seek to do so because we know it pleases God when we do, not to receive recognition for self. If God has gifted you to sing, certainly you should do that. You should use your gift. But you should also find yourself just as quick to serve others in a humble manner that won't draw any attention toward yourself. In fact, we know that we're serving God alone when the only person who knows we're serving is God. That's the one time you know you're safe from doing it for an ulterior motive. And that's the kind of service our King demands. Our King's greatness should capture our full attention. Our King's greatness demands humble service toward others. That's item number 3 that we see here this morning. Lastly, idea number 4. Our King's greatness produces no rivalry in serving him. No rivalry. Verse 49. John answered and said, Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to prevent him, because he does not follow along with us. But Jesus said to him, Do not hinder him, for he who is not against you is for you. The disciples had a really hard time getting past their desire for greatness, didn't they? John answered. That shows that John is responding to the things Jesus has just said. Those words about the greatness with the child standing there. Jesus says, receive this child. And John says, sure, Lord, we can do that. But it's fine that we stop these other people, right? They're horning in on our turf. And that's not cool, is it? Okay, that is a bit of a paraphrase, but essentially that's the attitude that John seems to display. It's as if Jesus' words just bounced right off him. We are the disciples. These other guys can't do the things that we do. And we made sure to tell them that. We're good, right? I trust you recall that, interestingly, these 4 short events began with the disciples unable to cast out a demon. And now here is someone who's apparently able to do that. They're doing it in Jesus' name, and the disciples want to stop that person from doing so. Why? Because he does not follow along with, what's the last word? Us. He doesn't follow along with us. The emphasis is on self, not Jesus. I've got to believe that John really expected that Jesus would agree with him. He was expecting, yep, you're right. But Jesus does the exact opposite. Do not hinder him. Leave that guy alone. Why? Because he who is not against you is for you. We need to notice 2 things here. First, there is no neutral option. Jesus makes that clear. You're either on his side or you're against him. There's no fence straddling with Jesus. In essence, Jesus is the line that divides the field of players in the cosmic war between good and evil. You either stand with Jesus on the side of good or you are on the side of evil. Second, notice there is no room for rivalry between those who are on Jesus' side. All who serve on his side serve him. We are not serving ourselves. We're not trying to earn our own acclaim or gain recognition for ourselves. We are serving Jesus. And we do that together, not independently. The idea is pretty easy to understand. But that doesn't make it so easy to live out. Like the disciples, we all desire self-promotion. We all want recognition, and that desire runs deep within us. Yet Jesus makes it clear we need to overcome that desire if we are going to serve well on Team Jesus. We need to overcome our self-centered desires if we're going to serve our King's greatness. Since the Shermans are with us this morning, I'll use Kevin as my example. Sorry, Kevin, I didn't warn you about this, but we heard Kevin report. We've heard he's working at the university. I mentioned that he's working alongside 2 other of our missionaries, and there's also Africans working there with them. There's a large group working together teaching at the university. Now, we personally know the Gasses and the Garcias. Imagine if you will, that Kevin and Hector Garcia, they both are primarily being concerned with being recognized as, of all these people, you are the greatest teacher there. In fact, their goal each, by the time they're done, they'll never admit this, but their goal is, by the time they're done, the largest building on campus needs to be named the Sherman Building or the Garcia Building. And when you pull up to the gate, there's this great statue. And guess who's on that statue? That's their goal. So they take every opportunity to put one another down and promote themselves because it's all about them. So do you think that little rivalry that would be happening when they both are looking at things this way might affect Matt Gass or other missionary? You know, every time Matt sees Kevin, Kevin says, you won't believe what Hector did today. And vice versa. Do you think they will remain effective working with each other? Do you think the university is going to be impacted if there was that kind of competition happening? For that matter, do you think they're effectively modeling Christ? Kevin mentioned the school has a heart for discipleship. All the students are united or connected with one of the faculty members. Do you think Kevin or Hector would be able to model Christ likeness? Could they even point people to the gospel? Now, it's easy for us to laugh at that scenario. We know this is so far outside their behavior that it's not even in the realm of comprehension for us. Yet, do we realize how easy it is for us to slip into lesser attitudes of rivalry? Our church is better than that other church. Our teaching is better than their teaching. My class is better than his class. I spend more time doing things for the church than she does. We can become John before we know it. We need to hear Jesus' words. Our King's greatness produces no rivalry in serving him. Our King's greatness should capture our full attention. That's the fourth idea in our text here this morning, is that there is no rivalry when we serve Jesus. When we serve our King. He is the only one we're focusing on. Our King's greatness should capture our full attention. At the outset, I said we may need a little dose of reality. We are naturally self-centered people. It's so easy for us to take our attention off our King and off his greatness and begin to imagine our own greatness. We need a dose of reality to move us out of our delusions and to put our attention back on our King's greatness. This morning we've looked at these 4 short little events that Luke collects together here and puts them one right after the other, all that focus on our King's greatness. First, we're reminded that our King displays God's greatness. Second, we're reminded that our King's greatness is displayed by his sacrifice. Third, our King's greatness demands humble service toward others. And then fourth, our King's greatness produces no rivalry in serving him. So, as we close our Bibles this morning and we prepare to move into another week, what reality check do you need? We are not going back into a week in which we are great. We are going into a week in which our King, Jesus, is great. Are we going to spend time this week pointing to his greatness? Or we're going to waste our time this week because all we are doing is promoting our own delusions of greatness? Our King's greatness should capture our full attention. Father, I pray this morning that you would grip all of us with the greatness of our Savior, our King. And may we live within that grip. May it make a difference in how we conduct our lives this week. May we serve him. May we serve one another humbly. Father, that is all we have time for. That is all that we should have room for in our lives, because our lives are for him. Father, show us where we need to change today and work within us this week. For it's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.